So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on understanding the role of a staff engineer. It's the first in our series around defining the IC career ladder. So this particular webinar is going to last 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the Lead Dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Staff Plus channel. We'll also take some questions live. So submit those through the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll get to them either in the middle or try to get to a few at the end. Let's get started with some introductions, I guess. So my name is Patrick Shields, and today I'm joined by Lori, Casa, Andrew, and Allison, and they're going to be here to share their experiences and their insights. So let's get each of them introducing themselves. Lori, you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Barth. I am a senior software engineer at Netflix. And in my spare time, I build a lot of Lego sets, as you can see. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll mostly just be seeing me build Lego sets.
Andrew?
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew. I am a staff engineer at Lyft, the ride-sharing company, and I've been there for about 3 years. And prior to that, I spent several years in software consulting at an agency called Carbon 5. And prior to that, I was an engineering manager at a self-publishing startup.
Casa?
Hey, my name is Ross Casa Williams. Most recently, I've been a senior staff engineer at MailChimp. We recently got acquired, so titles have changed. For the past 4 years, I've been in the data engineering space. Now I'm in a general backend engineering distributed systems space.
Last but not least, Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Capter. I'm a staff engineer at pilot.com, which is a startup that's automating the financial back office. Before that, I was at Dropbox working on the desktop client. Moved from more of an infrastructure side to more of a product engineering side, which has been pretty interesting. Before Dropbox, I was at the Recurse Center, which is effectively a writer's retreat for programmers out of New York. And I actually started my career in the finance industry, which was not so relevant. And then I have to kind of come back with Pilot, where having some knowledge of bookkeeping and accounting has been pretty useful.
Cool. So just to sort of set the stage for this discussion, when I started my career, the term staff engineer was not on my radar at all. I'd never heard of it. And nowadays, it seems like most companies have some type of staff role or a comparable title. But it's not just a shift in titles. It seems to me like it's a fundamental rethinking of what a software engineer's role can be. And so today, we're going to talk with these engineers who all have experience operating at the staff level and try to learn what goes on beyond just the title. So to get us started, Lori, what skills do you use most as a staff engineer?
Writing, and a lot of reading. Honestly, communication skills more than anything. And that's mostly for the purposes of collaborating across a large group of people and sort of aligning on what are we going to build? How are we going to build it? What edge cases do we need to worry about in an organization as large as Netflix? There's a lot of how are other people doing this? And does it make sense for us to do it the same way so that there's some sort of paved path within the organization that other people can then build on? But weirdly, I code more than the average staff engineer. And that's just because I'll talk about this later, but pretty much every engineer at Netflix is at the staff level, which means that there's less of a hierarchy of the staff engineers sort of helping to architect and determine the path for everybody else. Everyone does that somewhat for themselves in collaboration with everybody else. So I'm still coding every day. And I know we'll talk about that later, but it's the majority of skills are still writing, reading, collaboration. So writing, reading, talking, basically, is what I do most of the day, which is why I'm here talking to you, I guess.
You're well prepared for this panel then. So that's interesting. And you talked about sort of setting a path and laying track for other people to work on. Andrew, can you talk a little bit about how you know what to work on?
Yeah, I mean, what do you work on as a staff engineer? It's like when you reach this sort of role, everything becomes way more blurry and ambiguous. Perhaps you've come up the career ladder, you come through the IC ladder, and at every stage you knew hey, I got to ship this product or I got to build this feature. My job is the health of my team. But when you start to get into the staff role, you're generally operating more at the level of the organization or the group. And because of that, you are now entering the world of strategic thinking. You're now entering the world of, your product owners or your engineering director, and you're answering questions that are way more fuzzy, like what's the health of the group, or like, hey, is this big initiative, crucial to this percent of the company's revenue, or, some big strategic initiative, is it going to succeed? So big question, like, what do you work on? So I would first make sure you know what your boss or your, like, the authority that you report to, what they want you to work on, right? Like, what are the big goals for your group? And a lot of those could be fuzzy, right? And a lot of those could be like weirdly very specific, fuzzy in terms of like, hey, we need to make sure we bring on this partner because, we see 3 years out in the future, they're super important to us. Or it could be as specific as get off of, EC2, get onto Kubernetes or something like that. So, I would say like the big picture things need to be aligned. But then once you start getting into the nitty gritty of it, every day, the kinds of things I work on tend to be more project oriented. I personally, for myself, I still am on a couple of projects. So usually I'm checking in on the status of projects, and I'm making sure that they're healthy. Like, we're making sure we're planning things right, and we're making sure they're humming, and like they're like people are unblocked. But in general, it is pretty fuzzy. I'm curious what other people here also think about that as well.
So I just want to note that it took 6 minutes and 25 seconds until Kubernetes was mentioned in this webinar.
It was an inevitability.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time, and I was curious how much time. So you talked a lot about planning, and I know, Casa, I'm pretty sure you said that you are involved in planning inside your organization. Can you talk a little bit about your role in that?
Yeah, so in my current role, I maybe can talk about my previous role as well if needed. But so in my current role, I serve as tech lead for one of the teams in a new engineering group that I'm in, and serve as a general member of the leadership team for the entire engineering group. From a planning point of view, right? So we're building internal systems. Our customers are the product engineers on product teams. And so involved in setting, product strategy and product vision. That's, what problem we're working on, what we're going to do to solve it, and then kind of outlining a vision for what the target experience or developer experience would be. And then whatever the resulting roadmap is from there. So heavily involved in that. And so it's mostly led by myself as the tech lead and the tech lead of the partner engineering team for the stuff we're building. Starting next year, we're going to try to make it a little more expansive than that. So not just having the tech leads kind of lead a lot of that, allowing the other engineers on the team to kind of pitch ideas for where we should head, what stuff we should work on, that kind of thing. And so I'm interested to see how that works out, but that's how I've been doing from the product side. And I say just organizationally, helping the manager of my specific team and the director of the engineering group to understand how big the team should be, right? Should they remain small? Should they get to maybe 8 people? Should they grow more than that? What new team should be spun up? And doing kind of product vision and product strategy for that as well. So mostly on the product side, internal systems, but on the product side and the organizational side for sure.
Cool. That pitching ideas bit sounds really interesting. Maybe in a webinar in a year, we'll get the report on how it goes. So that you talked a lot about product, which I think is interesting. I'm always interested in the intersection between staff engineers and product work and product thinking. I know, Allison, you work with product managers in your day-to-day, right? Can you talk a little bit about what that's like and how that's different as a staff engineer than maybe it was earlier in your career?
Sure, absolutely. I was pretty surprised to find myself on the product side. It happened quite gradually. When I was working at Dropbox, I never worked with a designer. And then we got a product manager sort of later in the game. I think in that space, especially for Dropbox, the core product is pretty clear cut. You can tell if it's working or not in a fairly straightforward way. At Pilot, working with a product manager has been super useful. And I think that the main thing that the product manager is crisp on is trying to keep us focused on what we're trying to accomplish and like what is the problem we're trying to solve and how are we going about solving it, as Casa was saying. For me, a lot of the time, the deeper the product context, the more we can kind of find a fast path through the work that we need to do. So someone is coming to me and I can really understand what they're trying to solve. I can see how that fits into our existing architecture. I can see like how the systems that we've built could accommodate a particular system or a particular solution. And then at Pilot, the other thing that crops up is we have product specialists who are domain experts. So a lot of our product work actually requires deep financial and accounting knowledge. And I have like a little bit of financial knowledge and even less accounting. And so having someone come in and say, hey, I've read this 65-page paper on capitalization treatment for fixed assets, here's the bottom line, is incredibly useful. So having that system to make sure that we are getting input from our domain experts when we need it is great.
I would be very thankful for anyone who saved me from reading that 65-page paper. So that sounds like perf packet material right there from my perspective. So let's change gears a little bit. Some of the people watching this are probably already staff or principal engineers, but I'm sure some of the people watching this are still sort of moving through their career path. And so, Andrew, can you talk a little bit about how you know when you're ready to be promoted as a staff engineer?
Oh man, if I actually knew this, we'd all, if I had $1 for every time someone asked me, like, am I ready? I'd probably be $10 richer. But in reality, nobody really knows when you're ready, because some of the like criteria for some time have been kind of ambiguous. And so oftentimes when I talk to people that are like, hey, I want to go into staff engineering, am I ready? You need to take a step back and ask yourself, like, hey, why do you want to do this? Is it because it's the next step on the rung of the ladder? And quite honestly, like I don't take away from anybody who like naturally, like you want to progress, right? That's a very natural motivation. And that's not something to like, to put down or anything like that. But do realize that when you step into the role of staff engineering, you're actually stepping away from some of the dopamine triggers, that you get as a senior IC, maybe on a team, the satisfaction of maybe like hitting a commit, and pushing up a PR or merging a branch and then like going away for the weekend, that will disappear, or it starts to fade away, at least from my perspective or in my experience, but staff engineers, if you start to actually really care about, the OKRs that your team or your group is hitting, you have great collaborative like experience talking with product managers, kind of like Allison said. If you like get along really well with designers, product managers, or like you're thinking about things strategically, that's already a sign that you are thinking at the level of a staff engineer. Also, if you're able to kind of see and step back and see problems that maybe span different groups, right? Like if you're like looking at, you're in a product team here in this line of business, and over there on the other line of business, you're like, hey, I see a connection. The thing I'm building could actually help over there. Like that's like, and that's potentially an opportunity for you to move in and maybe like build a bridge or build a platform or something like that can kind of help you solve like a few problems with one solution. So staff engineering is very much kind of like, yeah, you step back, you have a strategic mindset, and you also have like the eyes to be in lots of places in the organization at once, so that you're able to spot these opportunities or some of these problems, and then you can maybe like put forth kind of solutions and stuff like that. There's the other question of like, how do you get promoted to be staff engineer? And maybe that's a different question to be answered by this panel later in the future, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the strategic mindset that you're talking about is super interesting. And it's often, I often get asked sort of, okay, cool, like, but how do I do that when I'm not a staff engineer? I think for a lot of people, there's this feeling like it's a bit of a chicken or an egg problem. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in quickly on that, but otherwise we can move on.
I can jump in on that one. One of the mistakes that I made early in my career was I was working with this terrific tech lead and staff engineer at Dropbox, and I looked at him and his work, and I was like, okay, I'm ambitious and I want to be a great engineer, and I see that he's a great engineer, and so I'm going to do more of those things. And I think at the time I didn't understand how different the role that I was in was different than his role. And in particular, as the tech lead and the staff engineer, he was sort of keeping track of everything, watching every bug, reading every pull request, was making sure that if anything dropped through the cracks, he was going to catch it, and didn't have a lot of time to work on, core projects. And when I was a newer engineer, what I should have been doing is really keeping focus on my project and making sure I got that execution nailed down. And then later I would move on to this more team level strategic stuff. So one of the things I try to be careful about now is making sure that when I have, ambitious earlier career engineers, that they understand the ways that their role is different than mine, and that doing exactly the stuff that I'm doing isn't necessarily the right move for them at that time. And then at some point you shift into trying to make the leap into staff, and it will be. But if you're a new grad, that's probably not the right choice.
That's great advice. Not everyone can just write design docs all day. That'd be a terrible future. Speaking of not just writing design docs, Lori, you already alluded to the fact that you still write a lot of code in your job, and that maybe the staff position or staff level role is different at your current position. So how much do you code? What are you coding? And sort of, I don't know, how does it make you feel to be coding that much?
I code every day. Normally it's about 50% of my day, because there's meetings and docs and reading and writing and all of those things that I mentioned earlier. But it's pretty much every day. So the reason it's so high is because everyone else on my team is also doing all of those amazing overarching things that Allison was just talking about. So versus it falling on one individual, it falls to everyone, which is a unique thing about how Netflix is structured. But that means that I sort of have my feet in both worlds, so to speak. So I have to be keeping the overarching sense of sort of what is going on everywhere. I'm doing a lot of PR reviews. I'm doing a lot of design docs. I'm doing a lot of collaboration conversations. And then I have to go implement a lot of those things. And it's particularly challenging because you're both implementing and keeping an eye on what everyone else is implementing and what is all happening. So it's there's top cover because there are other people doing those things, but you're also sort of doing everything at once. How do I feel about coding every day? Great. It's one of the ways that I sort of keep myself grounded in some of the implementation aspects of these larger design conversations that are happening. Because, for example, I haven't worked in Java in 6 or 7 years, and our backend is written in Java, and I'm contributing to that sometimes, or I'm code reviewing that sometimes, or I'm designing the architecture and implementation for that sometimes. And it's really, really hard to do that if I was just abstractly talking about the Java that I wrote 6 years ago. I have to be in it more in order to be relevant in those conversations at all. So it does work out and balances out in different ways than I'm sure other people's roles do. But it's a unique way of being a staff engineer. I think it's less I'm helping other people complete their code, and I have my own features that I have ownership of, in addition to sort of shepherding other features along and looking at the overall project's health.
I was going to quickly ask if each person could give their percentage. I'm just interested, including you, Patrick. So I was going to say, on my previous team, where I was the tech lead and team manager, I was at 25% where I would code. I think in my current role, where I'm not playing the team manager role, I'm only serving as the tech lead. It's more 50-50. So it's more where Lori is right now, assuming that it'll change as our kind of strategy changes, but that's where I'm at right now.
So I'll go. I recently changed positions. I'm 10 weeks into my new job, and I went from a role where I really was not writing very much code at all. I've 1%. Unless you count really sketchy Python scripts to pull data and I don't think that counts. If you don't get it reviewed properly, it doesn't count. And in my new role, I would say right now maybe I'm at 1 out of 3. So my new role, by the way, is I'm a staff software engineer at Stripe. Maybe 33% coding. It's the signal's still kind of spiky, and I often find that when I change roles, change teams, change companies, I tend to go and code more for a lot of the reasons Lori was talking about. I think in that, nobody wants somebody to show up and just be like, I think you should do it like this, and like have no idea how it actually works. And it gives you a lot of context. Allison, do you want to tell us about how much code you're actually writing?
Sure. I think I'm probably coming in the highest by virtue of being at the smallest company. But for me, it's, if you're ignoring meetings, it's like probably 50 to 80%, depending on whether it's a planning moment or not. And again, just to echo what Lori said, I think you really have to be, in the code to understand what needs to happen. And so earlier this year, I hadn't worked in JavaScript at all. I came from InfoSide and was like solidly a backend engineer. And that was like more and more of a gap for me as a staff engineer trying to understand our architecture. And so I spent the first half of this year really trying to ramp up on JavaScript and Vue and understand what my colleagues have been, challenges that they've been running into and those sorts of things. So definitely highly recommend staying in the code if you can at all.
I can go. I'm maybe probably the least out of everyone here. Probably currently at 10 to 15%. I am in a unique position right now where I'm kind of covering for my manager, who has recently left the company, so we're kind of transitioning, and I'm also going on paternity leave in a month or so. So I'm actually trying to extricate myself from critical path, and I'm trying to actually get more of my team doing more things. So I'm actually reading a lot of code, doing code review, pull requests, design docs, and keeping my eye out on a whole bunch of different work streams that are kind of coming in from all angles. So, and I weirdly feel okay with it. Maybe earlier on in my career, I was like, just let me code, and now I'm just like, I'm okay with it. I feel like I've arrived at this Zen moment, just like I've just accepted my fate. And it's actually kind of fun writing docs. Maybe I'm in the minority, but I do enjoy it.
A Zen moment is the perfect way to go into your parental leave. I assure you. Yeah, there will be disruptions. So we've gotten a couple interesting questions in the Q&A, and one of them seems really relevant to this. So I'm just going to throw it out there and hope one of you will grab it. The question is from Andre, and Andre says, it seems that it is more important to have soft skills and leadership skills than technical skills for a staff engineer role. Curious if anyone has a reaction to that.
More important is an interesting phrase. I think you will use those skills a lot more than you do as a software engineer at a lower level. And that's why we sort of highlight them, because it is one of the bigger changes and one of the things you need to ramp up on in order to transition from junior to mid-level to senior to staff, whatever your ladder is. But you cannot do a staff engineer job without technical skills. If you had purely soft skills, it would not work. Because as Allison was pointing out, as I was pointing out, as everyone has mentioned, you have to understand what's going on in the code at a very, very deep level in order to be able to have all of these soft skills conversations, because it's hard to communicate with people. It's hard to write. It's hard to read and really deeply understand things. But it's even harder to do that about technical topics. That is not an easy thing. And so the only way you can be successful is is if you deeply understand the technical topics. And one of the things you'll notice when you're a staff level engineer, as Allison pointed out, she wasn't working in JavaScript. She was working in infra, and now she's working in JavaScript. I've done a similar thing where I was working in dev tooling, and now I'm working in a full stack app with a Java backend that I haven't done since early in my career. You have to be able to jump in at a high level and deeply understand technology that you may not be intimately familiar with, which means you have to be able to ramp up really quickly. And you have to be able to take a little bit of time, understand the code that you're working with, and then translate all of those soft skills and apply it to that code base. So you have to be deeply technically proficient and then layer those other skills on top of that and recognize that you're shifting from focusing on one skill set to focusing on the other skill set. But you need that base and foundation first, or it won't work.
I think the answer to this also really depends on what you think of as softer leadership skills and what you think of as technical skills. And so one way I think most companies structure the career ladder is that at staff engineer, you are having more of an impact than you did at earlier levels. You're influencing across the organization or across your division. And the way to do that is by communicating really effectively about technical topics, or one of the ways to do that. So if you look at, you write a great design doc that another team can understand and helps them integrate with your system. Is that soft skills or is that technical skills? you're working with a colleague and you identify that they're thinking about a problem in a slightly wrong way, and you can give them a new framing that unlocks their implementation or unlocks the way that they're writing code in general. Is that soft skills or is that technical skills? So thinking about leveraging the like, you have the ability to write code, and how do you multiply yourself out, I think is typically the key piece of moving up the ladder.
So this has clearly spawned some interest from our viewers. There's a couple questions in the Q&A that are all around the sort of difference between management, being an engineering manager versus staff engineer, the relationship between engineering managers and staff engineers. And I'm going to sort of morph those a little bit because I have a theory that there's a slight difference in the way you think about this question. And that is the difference between a staff engineer and like a line engineering manager, someone who's managing a team that's responsible for delivery, or maybe two teams, versus the difference between a staff engineer type role and say a director or something like that. So I think we can sort of take those separate avenues. And the first one I want to take is the director sort of thing. So Casa, you work really closely with the director. You report to a director, I think. You might have mentioned that a little bit earlier. Can you talk about what that relationship is like and how your relationship with engineering management has changed?
Yeah, say at MailChimp, I've reported to a senior director, a senior engineering manager, and a director. I did that out of order. A senior engineering manager, a director, and a senior director. Probably make more sense. I'd say at the kind of director and senior director level, you get a lot of access to organizational problems, opportunities, and challenges, right? So if you're partnering with a kind of manager who's not a manager of managers, they could just manage individual contributors, directly focused on their team's kind of goals and roadmap, versus a director or senior director who are thinking about multiple teams or an entire organization within the engineering department. The way they view challenges and opportunities is just much different. And so when you're thinking about kind of up-leveling yourself, there's advantages to reporting to someone at that level. When you're thinking about how do I become strategic? How do I think strategically? How do I have impact across multiple teams, not just my team? Being able to understand what the people at that level are thinking about is a very, very good insight. I'd say another one of the benefits to reporting to a director or senior director is if that person is a good delegator, like literally because you're reporting to them, you will get opportunities to work on those challenges, right? And so that's another kind of benefit to reporting to someone at that level. If you want to work on not just team stuff, but things that impact the entire engineering organization, you kind of unlock some of those opportunities just by reporting to that person. And I guess the last thing I'll say there is we kind of touched on like, how do I get opportunities to kind of do that strategic stuff, right? Reporting to the person, but also a good tactic or thing to keep in mind is that in my experience, you're never going to be asked beforehand, like, what do you think about this like organizational problem we're having? You'll never be like told a week in advance, like, hey, think about this thing. I'm going to ask you in a week about your choices here. So one of the things I do a lot is just ask a lot of questions, ask them what the top 3 problems or priorities are. I always have a sense of like what they're thinking about. And so my director or senior director will always kind of say, hey, I'm looking at this thing here. What do you think about this? And because I had known that it was a problem for them before, and I had thought about it a little bit, I had a response to give to them. And so over time, I would get to be seen as a partner to that person rather than just someone reporting to them. And so that's something you can do to like proactively prepare yourself for the opportunity to kind of have opinions on things at the organizational level.
Yeah, I think that understanding your manager's point of view, your director's point of view becomes really important. That's a great call out. So the other angle I want to take on this question is we have in our midst a former engineering manager. and actually maybe acting engineering manager. So Andrew, I believe you were an engineering manager at one point. You crossed over and now you've come back. What made you return to this side?
That's right. I was maybe mid-career, early mid-career. My manager at a former company left and asked me to step up and fill his shoes. So I did, not knowing what I was getting myself into, and that was like a roller coaster ride for about a year and a half of my career. And at the end of that roller coaster ride, I said I want to go back to coding because I was coming to the office super early before all my meetings started, so I could go back to coding. But being able to be a manager helped me see the organization and understand the mindset, kind of like what Costa was saying, like what was on the mind of senior leadership. Talking to like other directors or like the CTO, kind of like, oh, this is what you're thinking about, and also thinking about like organizational problems. Now, as a staff engineer, like on the other side, that makes me really, really in tune or like pretty empathetic to some of the problems or challenges that people are thinking. They're thinking about morale. They're thinking about organizational health. They're thinking about like how to scale for the next 2 or 3 years. Whereas, as an engineer, I would never really think about that. So they're thinking about like recruiting pipelines and how are we going to hit certain targets, and the senior executives have said this. How are we going to meet that? And so having been in the hot seat on that side before, I'm just thinking about that a lot more. And I would just say like it helps them watch out for my team a little bit more too. Like as an engineering manager, you're always having conversations with people about like, are you happy? How can I help you grow? And those are conversations I'm having in my one-on-ones too with my team as well. Hey, are you happy? How can I help find you opportunities to help you grow? So I would say those are like major pluses to having been on the other ladder. I came back and fortunately in our industry, it's not uncommon to keep moving back and forth. So.
Yeah, I think there's even a few folks who are proponents of it. You should swing on the pendulum back and forth. But it seems like you're the only one in the panel, so I'll just leave that there. Let's change gears a little bit. We just talked a lot about management, and there's a question on OKRs that I really want to take because it's OKRs. That sounds like a fun, fiery topic for the panel with 2 minutes left. But let's change gears just a little bit because there's a totally different angle on this that I'm curious about, which is some of the people in the audience are staff engineers, and we've talked about how to sort of grow into a staff engineer position, but I'm always interested in how you continue learning and growing as a staff engineer. And Allison worked at the Recurse Center, as she mentioned, has given conference talks that involve sort of learning and growth. And so I'm really curious, Allison, if you can tell us a little bit about how you think about learning and growth as a staff engineer.
Absolutely. So I think there's sort of two angles to take this question. One is what your own learning and growth is. And then the second one is what sort of learning and growth focused environment you're creating for your team. The one liner from my conference talk basically is that if you can bring a growth mindset and a learning oriented mindset to your work as a staff engineer or to your work as a software engineer in general, you can have a really fun time. And if you are not doing that, I think you're setting yourself up for a lot of suffering, because most of the time as software engineers, we are trying to solve problems that we have not solved before. You're almost always working at the boundary of your expertise. If you have done something before, you're probably still using that code. And so you don't, every day is a fresh new challenge or a fresh new set of struggling if you're not welcoming that. So that's the baseline. I think for myself as a staff engineer, one of the really interesting things for me was discovering, with the other staff engineers I work with, all of us are very different people and very different kinds of staff engineers. Like there's more of kind of an architect focus. There's someone who's really good at going away for a couple of months and coming back with a prototype or something that's pretty well formed. There are folks who are really focused on mentorship and sponsorship and growing the team. So part of being a staff engineer and farther up the IC ladder as well is the path that you're on for you to be successful is going to be specific to you. And if you are going to be terrifically successful in your career, you're going to do that in a way that plays to your strengths and isn't trying to shore up your weaknesses constantly. You have to work around your weaknesses, but if you're focused on the things you're already good at, then that's the direction is going to be easier. So I try to think about where I can contribute specifically to my team. What are the things that like I'm the person who should be doing them, as opposed to someone else on the team or someone else in the organization. And then the other piece of learning for staff engineering, I think, is, are you creating opportunities and creating space for the rest of your team to have those learning experiences? And a big part of that staff engineering is stepping back. We see this in incidents and in project planning, that like, oh, here's a design doc. I know I can, bang this out in an afternoon, but instead I want to give this to a colleague who can spend, most of the week trying to work through these questions, and I can facilitate them talking to other people in the organization, and making sure that you're not grabbing all the like strategic or higher level work for yourself, and are also providing those opportunities to people you work with.
I see some connections between what you just talked about earlier. You gave an example of basically trying to like follow someone else's path, another sort of engineer that you looked up to or was more senior in your organization. I think that that concept of like, as you get into being a staff engineer, that the paths are not as well trod, and you need to sort of find one for yourself, is a super interesting insight that I wouldn't have put my finger on before this. Cool. We've got a little less than 10 minutes left, and I want to save that OKR question for the last one, because that seems like fun to me. But we have a bunch of great questions from the people who are watching this. Let's go ahead and jump to anyone can answer this. I think actually poor Allison's going to get dragged in again on this one, but maybe somebody else can take a first crack at it. Someone asked, are there any thoughts about at what size a company needs to have a staff engineering level?
I have a dangerous answer. So I was a staff engineer at a company of like 50, and I think there were 10 of us. So there's a couple things that come to mind. So one is like, there is this idea of title inflation depending on what company you're at, and a lot of startups tend to have it because that's how you attract really senior people to help you build your architecture early on. So startups are sort of like, they have different rules in terms of how many staff engineers you might expect compared to the rest of the engineering population. The second thing is, and I struggle with saying this, but it is not always the case that a staff engineer will be like an architect. Like, we've been talking a lot about a staff engineer existing at sort of this higher level. It depends on what your ladder is. There are places where senior engineer is the highest title. I work in one of those places. I know other organizations that are like that. There are places where a staff engineer is the highest title. There are places where staff level 1 is like the third engineering title on the rung, and there's about 4 or 5 after them. So it depends entirely on what ladder you're on as to whether a staff engineer exists and what their role in the organization is. So startups have sort of different rules, but depending on your ladder, take a look at what's below that title and above that title. Theoretically, you don't want the top title to be the one that like the majority of people are, because that doesn't really make sense. Then it's like, who's in charge? But again, that's different at different organizations. I mean, pot calling kettle, right? But it's not as consistent as at what point do you introduce this title, because the title means different things to different people, and different organizations want their weighting of seniority to be different depending what size they're at, what level of scaling they're at, in like the maturity of their architecture and that sort of stuff. Sorry, that was sort of rambly, but it depends, which is such a freaking staff engineer answer. I'm sorry.
I was just going to quickly add to that and say, I guess at a more general level, you kind of asked about staff engineers, but I think at a more general level, if you have someone at a company, a startup or a much bigger company that's thinking about technical strategy and thinking about, technical direction and providing technical leadership, maybe that's one person, maybe that's a group of people that do it by committee. then the titles, whatever the title of the people are or the group are, kind of fades away a little bit. So as long as you have someone that's kind of thinking about the system end to end, depending on if it's, you're a startup and you have like one monolithic application, someone thinking about things end to end, or if you're a bigger company, there's multiple systems in play, someone thinking about a system or a set of systems end to end and providing direction on where you're going. I think that is a key or transformational role that someone in the company or some group of people in the company is playing. And I think it'll be beneficial to have that at any point in the company. I guess at a startup, it's usually the CTO or the founding CTO that does a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, Pilot had a career ladder quite early on. I think it was like year 3, maybe. And I think the benefit of that, it was like for the founders, this is their 3rd startup. And so they like kind of knew what they wanted. And I think it also gives a fair amount of clarity to your engineering team in general and the team more broadly, that like, hey, I want to get to the next level. What does that look like? So it does create a framework for people to talk about career advancement. To Lori's point, I think what staff means is really specific to an organization. And so if you can read that ladder and see what it means to your organization, that's quite useful. And also talking to your engineering manager and sort of leadership more broadly to say like, what are the expectations here, and how do those match with my skills? I think having something like the ladders and the titles are both tools for getting more aligned on what that means.
It depends. We should have just said it depends. That was all really great detail, but I do really like the just it depends. Cool. So another question here that is very near and dear to my heart as someone who just switched roles comes from Jonathan, and they asked, when joining a new company as a staff engineer, there's often a lot of pre-existing history and context that's important to strategic conversations. They specified business, technical, and relational, which I'll assume that last part is what I would call political and not about database tables, but we could go that direction. So Jonathan asked, do you have any recommendations about how to ramp up and be effective quickly?
I can speak briefly to this. So I will say that I didn't know this when I first started and when I first joined. So I spent about a year working on my team thinking that I was doing well, when in reality, I wasn't like scaling to meet the expectations that were asked of me. So I really appreciate this question because it's what I wish I had asked. I would say that you should, like, in order to find out who you should be talking to, you should probably like try to build relationships, right? And in our remote world, it's both easier and more difficult to make relationships than ever before, right? So so you're going to probably be needing to set up one-on-ones with the right people. How do you know who the right people are? Ask your manager, right? Who should I be talking to? But then when you go talk to other people, like when you go talk to those people, you should be asking them, hey, who else should I be talking to? You're going to want to establish the right relationships. And then you're probably going to meet some people where you're going to say like, hey, nice to meet you. But you probably don't need to be talking to them like every single week, right? But there are some other people, maybe probably your product owner if you're on a product team, or probably certain stakeholders, like your domain experts on your team, where you're going to be like, hey, like let's set up a recurring, right? And so you're going to basically need to figure out the right, like cadences to talk to these people. And quite honestly, like I would honestly say, make some small talk. It's a very sterile way that we're connecting these days. And if you meet face to face, in office, take some time to go out to lunch. The small, just kind of like human connections can go a really long way when you're talking to people, and they'll actually kind of like grease the wheels, so to speak, for future interactions that you need, especially when you're new, right? Like no one has context on who you are. And so when you come to them with like a big ask, you want to make sure that relationship's there already. So it's a bit of a fuzzy answer. I'm sorry, I wish I could be more specific. But I think just starting to build relationships with the right people is pretty important.
I onboarded like 8 months ago at this point, so I feel like my answer's decently fresh for this as well. The it depends answer also applies, but be a little bit easy on yourself. There's this expectation when you're at this level of engineering that you should be productive and like going full out really quickly. And The problem at this level is that you need such large amounts of context that that's a really unrealistic expectation when you're being dropped into a completely new environment. It takes time to build that context. So you can do it in sort of myriad ways. It depends entirely on how you learn as a person and what approach you find effective. Talking to a lot of people, always a good start. If you're someone who wants to read a bunch of docs, if you're someone who wants to look through like the code base history, this is a weird thing, but if you're in a larger organization, ask people about the most recent reorgs. It is incredibly illuminating. It helps you learn the politics. It helps you understand like who has overlapping context that you're going to want. And it probably tells you some of the challenges they've faced at the same time. Some organizations reorg all the time. Some organizations don't do it very often, but it's one of those weird things you don't think to ask about that if it comes up in a conversation, it's all of a sudden incredibly illuminating. So like maybe ask ahead of time.
So I'm going to jump in. We are just a minute over right when reorgs came up and we didn't get to OKRs. We just left all the spicy stuff for afterwards. I want to thank you, Allison, Casa, Lori, Andrew, for being on this panel with me and letting me poke you with strange questions. I want to thank everybody who watched. If I can leave you with some parting thoughts, communication is important. Strategic thinking, it depends, and Kubernetes in 6 minutes and 25 seconds are the big takeaways from today. Myself and everyone on this panel will be over in the Staff Plus channel on the Lead Dev Slack to answer a few more questions. I'm sorry for the ones we didn't get to live. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.